Well, thank you very much, Dr. Goslin. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of discussion at the end of the panel. As a philosopher, I've been quite profoundly interested in this subject, and I thought I would give more of a theoretical paper and to see if there might be a contrast. So I'll start with what is evil? This is a loaded question. It presupposes that we adopt historical, well-conditioned discourse on its essence, cause, and function in human relations, not to mention supernatural speculations that color its very definition. Having said this, I wish to argue that there are certain metaphysical principles operative in any account of evil, such as the institution and or experience of pure or radical negativity, disorder, disharmony, or disintegration as a structural process endemic to the instantiation of destruction and decay. But these factors may also be viewed as a necessary complementarity to life. For without such events, there can be no change or growth, only stasis. Now, I cannot conceive of a universe without process. Therefore, without privation, variation, difference, conflict, and negation, there would be no motion, evolution, or creativity. Hence, negativity in itself cannot be condemned as evil, and in fact may be deemed a metaphysical good because it leads to variation, heterogeneity, and plurality. But this discourse on metaphysical evil hardly satisfies our quest for an answer to its essence. Natural disasters and tragedies happen every moment. From the Lisbon earthquake that sparked the theodicy movement to overcome the aporia of how such systemic destruction could even be allowed by a benevolent Godhead, especially now when the problem of evil and gratuitous suffering remains the most severe challenge to justified theology, to the banality of death, from the butcher's block to political warfare and military science. But we do not impart a malevolent intent to the impersonal hands of cosmic forces. They merely happen through the blind random mutation of organic nature, as well as influenced or expedited by human intervention, as we may readily observe as global populations slowly destroy our planet through climate change, global warming, pollution, exploitation of natural resources, desertification, and the despoliation of our ecosystems. But when people burn coal to warm their homes or cook food, there's no malevolent intent to cause harm, only to survive. Despite the fact that these continued practices, if allowed to go unrestrained or unchecked, may bring about the demise of our planet, to call them intrinsically evil would mean that we must adopt or abort our natural inclinations toward self-sustenance, dependent upon a social infrastructure that promulgates and provides the necessities of life. This is not to say that society should not improve upon such cultural institutions through collective education and social consciousness, but to call them inherently evil, I suggest, is misguided. After all, most people value their own immediate concrete lives over an abstract principle or a fish in the sea, even if such suspension of reason or ethical myopia leads to slow global suicide. We must first attempt to isolate a key ingredient before formulating an answer to the question of the essence of evil. In paraphrasing Aristotle, for something to be, it must necessarily contain certain essential qualities, elements, or forms that make it what it is, without which it could not be or exist. In other words, if something does not possess certain features, it would not be fundamental to its nature. Hence, it would not be a vital aspect to its ontological structure. The essence of anything must be indispensable, critical, requisite, or basic, hence the lifeblood of its being. Does evil have an essential form? Does it have essential properties? And what would they be? If evil necessarily encompasses pure negativity, and negativity is an indispensable property to its constitution and appearance, then its instantiation must issue forth or bring about a modicum of violence. Violence may have many appearances, from the pulsating threat of passion or power to the intensity of fear, intimidation, felt aggression, overt hostility, brute force, abuse, ferocity, fury, viciousness, cruelty, savagery, death, and so on. Violence may also be lulled, implicit, or expectant, an imminent looming presence that suffuses our world, even if conspicuously absent, an invisibility that is felt. In this regard, violence is hidden, but is always there. We may say this is a metaphysical violence, as origin, as arche, the violence of being. Mind is an original form of violence, a violent coming into being, an awakening as internal rupture, as upheaval, as the self-violent manifestation of interruption. Subjective violence is the phenomenon of individual experience, which is the most salient among the masses, perpetrated by an identifiable agent or entity. By contrast, objective violence is both symbolic, that which is constituted through language and semiotic orders of understanding, as well as myriad forms in its sociologically and materially mode of appearances. In fact, language itself is violent. It places a proverbial demand on the other, whether solicited or through aggressive encroachments and superimposed universals of meaning. While systemic violence is instantiated through our economic and political institutions that are operating as concretely inscribed mechanisms within our cultural infrastructures and social ideologies. Here we may differentiate the ontological structural element of evil from their subjective phenomenological hermeneutical counterparts. A defining characteristic that differentiates subjective from objective evil is that subjective experience, or its qualitative hermeneutic equivalent, may elude a universal appraisal of its definition. This may be due to a lack of shared personal experience or history, linguistic meaning, social convention, consensus, or objective standards of measurement and their interpretation that separates the individual from the collective. We may readily observe this as the problem of relativity. Here, empathy may play a key ingredient in sympathizing with how another may interpret a particular personal experience as evil or not. But the form of the experience and its adjudication is nevertheless a solipsistic enterprise. The question becomes whether or not it is universalizable. Here is where a potential objective dimension materializes. Namely, does it resonate with other subjects and their subjectivities that can form some basis of consensus that is adopted as social convention? Whether this makes something objective is still another matter, for one can envision a community of others that holds on to propositional attitudes, false beliefs, emotional prejudices, distortions of truth and reality, and socialized delusions based on intersubjective fantasies peculiar to a group, mass, or culture. The God posit is a good example. Let us propose a distinction between A, an evil act, and B, an evil intention. An act always leads to some form of a consequence, while an intention may be passive, active, conscious, unconscious, and either linked to a motive or action, suspended, disavowed, or even held in check, hence non-enacted. For example, an act that brings about death may be accidental, such as a motor vehicle accident, but there was no intent to kill. The same applies to forces of nature, such as a tornado or tsunami. Weather has no personal intention to destroy. It is merely a series of random or teleonomic physical events. In these cases, death and destruction result from acts without intent, despite being tragic, dreadful, and disastrous. I would not classify these as examples of evil. Hence, for something to be evil, this requires agency. This implies that a certain modicum of intentionality is at play in operationalizing evil. Here, an intention always possesses an aim. And when it comes to the human psyche, this would necessarily require consciousness, even if consciousness lies on a continuum, that aims at a particular act as an intentional meant object. This means that an act that brings about a certain negative consequence we deem evil must stem from an intentional stance. Hence, it is deliberate, although not necessarily deliberated, as acts may be spontaneously enacted and not particularly well thought out. Albeit, it would have to stem from an intention all the same, for no action is devoid of a motive or purpose driving an act, even if it's unconscious. This brings us to speculate that a certain state of mind must be operative in acts of evil, whether this be A, dispositional, or B, intentional, as well as bearing a particular C, sorry for my formalness here, qualia, or D, psychic form, such as emotion, that's attached to the intentional act. And here is where we may consider a state of mind that is ontically or dispositionally aggressive, which is the manifestation of the purely negative split of the dialectic. Here, violence becomes an ontological feature structurally infused in the very essence of evil. This commits us to accepting a universalizing principle to evil. For every form of evil must participate of a rudimentary violence. We may further say that it is pure, abstract form. Dispositional violence is the inscription of radical negativity, while evil is the manifestation, hence the appearance or enactment, of dispositional violence. Not only is this subjectively constituted in each person, everybody, hence dispositional evil, it materializes in empirical reality when externalized in society. In other words, it takes on objective properties and consequences, is institutionally organized, signified, and represented in the concrete universals that comprise our social, economic, and political superstructures, and is systematically politicized through reinforced ideologies operative within hegemonic social, symbolic, and cultural unconscious processes. Not only is there a phenomenal appearance to evil, it is ontologically inscripted in the very fabric of worldhood itself. From the side of phenomenology, the qualitative appearance of intentionality manifests as a certain mode of dispositional violence that takes on a malevolent form. Here there is a certain malignancy, spitefulness, and maliciousness directed toward an object of aggression. Therefore, there must be a certain desire to hurt or cause pain to another person or thing, even if this is a pre-reflective act. Here the agent, the intent, and the act must display its dispositional violence, while the consequence may or may not bring about an evil outcome based upon the success or failure of the intentional act to achieve its goal. For example, the intent to inflict pain, suffering, or death on another may be thwarted, but the intentional act itself is nevertheless evil. Think of our everyday fantasies. Here we may say it's predisposed. The corollary is that dispositional violence ontically informs intentionality and action, including the act of thinking itself. This means that people are evil, and not merely their behavior. We don't often think that way, do we? Here we may conclude that the disposition toward evil is structurally constituted. Hence, human nature is predisposed toward violence in thought and deed. This means that the customary hackneyed definition of evil as deliberate malicious intent falls short because it fails to account for its innate, deep structural psychic precursors. Evil exists without malicious intent and merely becomes a question of disclosedness or concealment. Hence, the ontology of evil may or may not be enacted based on impulse and restraint, therefore relegating the domain of evil to a bifurcation between desire, emotionality, and thought on the one hand, and the behavioral instantiation of intentional action on the other. In other words, we are inherently evil as that which is ontostructurally innate, but not all people engage in evil endeavors. Here, a principle of restraint supersedes our base primitive constitutions. If not for the beacon of reason attuned to the reality principle, due to identification and empathy for others, the development of conscience, and the pursuit of the good or virtue as an ethical comportment. But this involves a process of socialization and domestication based upon self-renunciation and a taming of the inner shrew, the sublimation and foil of our primitive propensities. Thus far, we have deconstructed evil as having an ontological, hence a necessary and universal edifice, based upon our primordial psychic constitution that interpellates the individual and society by natural proclivity and desire, as well as through the objective institutionalization of social, semiotic, and symbolic practices that condition our being in the world. Therefore, the psychic dimension of evil is structural as both innate disposition due to our organic embodiment fueled by drive and desire, as well as socially superimposed by concrete, hence environmental, materiality via our thrownness into culture. Here, structuralization accounts for the universality of our corporeal and cultural embodiment as an objective fact suffused with metaphysical violence. But the phenomenal dimension of evil is concerned with lived subjectivity or psychic qualia. This may be radically relative or germane to personal experience under hermeneutic variance, even if shared by a collective ethos. We have already determined that a degree of intentionality must be operative, even if pre-reflexive, in conditioning the phenomenology of evil, but the qualitative forms of such appearances must appear from dispositional violence that ingress in the intentional act. The subjective state of mind is pertinent, as there is an affective, qualitative manifestation of malfeasance that is mobilized in evil intentionality through a negative emotional intensity of the will. However, we cannot restrict our definition to conscious intentionality, nor recapitulate the narrow pedestrian view that evil is born from malicious intent, or in the words of Heidegger, that, quote, the essence of evil is in the malice of fury, not in the mere baseness of human action, end quote. Evil is not merely about intention and action, or destruction of the moral law, or institution of the signifier, but rather is unconsciously structuralized as primordial ontological violence in the very masonry of the human psyche itself, hence the humanization of evil, yet one we can't help but moralize. Thank you.